Ready? Ready? Ready?
I just was scanning this article, and I don't know if I'm ready. Will ever be
Okay.
ready, but I'm as ready as I'll ever be. The Horse Race is brought to you by Benchmark Strategies, Boston's leading public affairs and public relations consulting firm. To learn more, connect with Benchmark on LinkedIn at Benchmark Strategies or visit benchmark-strategies.com.
Welcome back to The Horse Race, your weekly look at politics, policy, and elections in Massachusetts. I'm Jennifer Smith, reporter for Commonwealth Beacon, and it's Thursday, March 26th. Today we're talking ballot measures and whether or not they're helping or hurting the legislature do its own dang job. I'm here as always with the lovely Steve Koczela, president of the Massing Polling Group. And Steve, I have a very important question for you. Are you ready?
I'm ready, Jen. Serve it up.
Do you have an armed crossbow pointed at a deer somewhere in Massachusetts right now?
I do not, primarily because I'm in Kenya, but I actually know what article you're talking about, and I'm actually looking forward to this discussion. So tee it up, Jen. What is the topic of conversation? What is Blue Sky all mad about this week?
I don't know, man. Probably something. Probably this. I will say that this particular story taps into one of our favorite things here on the Horse Race, which is the weird stuff that Massachusetts insists on that nobody else has. And in this case, we have one of these old blue laws basically saying that we cannot hunt at all in Massachusetts. Maine apparently is the only other state in the country with that ban, and Governor Maura Healey would like to ease the law, specifically allowing a hunting of deer on Sundays. So again, Steve, you don't seem to be, furious about this unless you're hiding it extremely well.
I'm not furious about it. And part of that is because I actually do hunt deer. I only started when I was in the last few years. Like I didn't start hunting until I was 40, which newsflash for those listeners who didn't know, I am actually over the age of 40. But the thing is, there's actually a lot that goes into this. There's a lot that goes into it in the sense that deer hunting is one of those policy issues that has so many different angles to it. So just to list a couple of them, one of them is the destruction that deer create when there are too many of them. And we think of the most visible one, which is just, I ran into a deer, my car is now totaled, maybe somebody got hurt, But there's also things like the forest floor. They utterly destroy forest floors when there's too many of them. So you think like ground nesting birds, you're thinking all of the little animals and critters and other plants that count on there being an actual productive forest floor. You're thinking of then things like erosion, where forest streams start to overrun their banks when the vegetation's not right. You're thinking farms, where the deer are just wrecking farms, particularly in southeastern Massachusetts, where there's basically too many deer. There are farms, but it's a little too dense to have the amount of hunting that you would need.
Well, one of the ones that immediately came to mind on my end, just because of some things around family and in-laws, etc., is ticks. Basically, that you also have the very serious problem of deer ticks, you have Lyme disease, that sort of thing as well. So it's kind of a confluence of factors. We should note, of course, that the Healey administration says that 70% of the public input it received and solicited on this supports lifting the ban, but the MSPCA has long opposed these efforts here. They're basically saying that this is prioritizing the kind of small group of hunters who like nature over the large group of people who like nature who are not hunters. So it's not, a kind of slam dunk proposal, but one of the things that might also sound familiar here, if you have your little competitiveness drinking game going, is Maura Healey says that she doesn't want people basically trucking up to New Hampshire to go hunt on Sundays rather than hunt here in Massachusetts. So that's part of the politics of it. It's not just should we or should we not allow it kind of point blank in Massachusetts, but also if they are not hunting the deer with their crossbows here, they may well go somewhere else and do it. And is that a policy position that people should be in favor of? I am neutral on it as a non-hunter myself, but, I don't like ticks.
Yeah, ticks is another one for sure, and basically, it's one of the levers that policymakers have where they can try to influence how many deer hunters are able to take to kill, and if you want them to take more, which we do in Massachusetts right now, because there are way, way, way too many, then this is one way to do it. Is basically add another day. So other levers that they can and have recently pulled are things like how many are you allowed to take, how many are you allowed to take in a certain day, in a certain place. Crossbows, you mentioned crossbows, which is another policy change that they're considering, which basically makes bow and arrow hunting much easier. So you can think like people will be more successful if they can use a crossbow instead of a traditional, like you're drawing it back bow. So there's all kinds of different levers that they can pull. And in a situation where they're just trying to tweak it a little, maybe they would change a few days, they'd make the season start later or whatever. But in Massachusetts, the situation is there are way, way, way too many deer in eastern Massachusetts, particularly. And this is one big one that they can do to try to basically make there be fewer deer and undo or lessen some of the problems like ticks, like farm destruction, like, all the destruction of the natural habitat and so forth. And not to put too fine a point on it, but we as humans basically offed all of the predators. So now it's kind of up to us. Like whatever we don't want there to be too much of is now our responsibility.
All right, this has been your dispatch from the Midwest via Kenya.
Yeah. Also, venison tastes really good. You should eat it. It's like the most organic meat you can possibly get. It's like this happy animal that just had a great life instead of having to live in a farm. So that's my speech, and now I'm off my soapbox.
We are absolutely ruining my vegetarian mother's life with this conversation, but I will say she is in Utah where there is a long tradition of like elk and bison related stuff too. So, there's something for everyone except for the vegans this episode, and we are very, very sorry about that. And to distract you, we'll talk about housing ballot measures.
Let's do it. Let's move on. Today, we continue our tour through ballot measures, because if Jennifer has to sit through hearings, then I'm sorry to announce that so do you. No, really, we're actually deep enough into the ballot question process at this point that some trends are starting to emerge, and we thought it'd be fun to talk about those today. So, trends like, what do lawmakers actually think their job is? So, Jen, with that set up, this week it is housing, where we have not one, but two ballot questions to discuss. Where are we?
That's right. So today we're talking about two ballot measures on housing that basically took place in hearings over 2 days and weirdly sort of explained the absolutely wild situation that we find ourselves in. At a very high level right now, the story of most ballot measures might be familiar at this point to longtime listeners or anyone that, opens up that booklet every other year and goes, oh no, this is too many for me. There's already so much for me to deal with here. So basically, the ballot measures are usually based on proposals the legislature already had in front of them but doesn't want to work through either quickly or at all. Then the proponents get frustrated and then they take it to the voters. And some of those measures, especially this year, are proposing wildly different approaches to these sort of complex policy questions that are probably, I don't want to get beyond my skis here, best for the legislative process. And then lawmakers get mad at ballot campaigns for doing politics this way. So can I just ask, Steve, before we get into this, sort of as a check-in, where is your head at right now on ballot questions? Useful, broken, at least laws are happening, laws shouldn't happen this way. Where are you at?
Yes, I think all of those things would actually apply. Like, it is useful. Like, some good things happen through ballot measures, but I think it's undeniable that the process is broken. These things will cost, in some cases, tens of millions of dollars and are often being fought by organizations that are, outside of Massachusetts trying to use our state as sort of a laboratory or show that it can be done here so it could be done elsewhere and so forth. And one of your other items was, hey, at least laws happen. That's true because, as you noted, I think one thing that's important to mention is a lot of the policy ideas that end up as a ballot question have been around for year after year after year after year in front of the legislature, basically with nothing happening. That's not always true. Sometimes they kind of come out of left field and then we all have to figure out, where did this thing come from? Who's funding it? Is it good? Is it bad? Etc. Others have been endlessly debated and just sort of sit there and languish. So, and then your last thing was laws shouldn't happen this way. That's also probably true. Particularly some of the super complicated ones where it's like these things are much better set for where debate could happen, where the interests on all sides could be heard, where expert testimony could be solicited, and we could all discuss it and come up with the right idea. But when all those things kind of come together and something just sits there for year after year after year, you really can't blame advocates for eventually saying, okay, you know what, I'm not waiting anymore, we're just going to do this by ballot measure. So that's a lot of yeses to very seeming conflicting statements, but that actually I think also is kind of a good setup for some of the contrasts, inconsistencies, conflicts, et cetera, that happened at the hearings that you were attending and watching this week. So describe what was going on at those hearings. What were you keeping tabs on?
So I was looking at one ballot measure that is probably familiar to our listeners, which is one that would institute the strictest statewide rent control in the country here in Massachusetts. So in our show notes, we're going to have some links to earlier episodes where we discuss that in more detail. But in broad terms, with certain exceptions and carve outs, it would apply to all of the cities and towns of Massachusetts, limit on rent increases to either 5% or the rate of inflation, whichever is lower. So that's quite strict. The other one that I've been looking at, also in sort of broad terms, is one that would say you are allowed to build single family homes on lot sizes of like 5,000 square feet. So significantly reducing the size of lots in Massachusetts that you'd be able to build starter homes, provided they have access to basically essential utilities. So like water and sewer, for instance. And these two approaches are basically coming from completely different philosophical sides of how do you address the housing crisis. One of them is saying you have to deal with the ongoing real affordability spikes that we've been dealing with in the rental market. And the other one is a very supply side oriented. If you build more, it will relieve pressure on the system process. So these two things are not necessarily in direct conflict with each other. Like you could reasonably say, I want to cap rents and also we should build more. But there's an asymmetric tension, which is the people who are kind of pushing for that supply side argument tend to say, hey guys, we're trying to loosen these pressures on the system. And you over on the rent control side are actually proposing something that would tighten restrictions on that system. It could have knock-on effects. It could end up kind of reducing the profitability of rental properties, and that might discourage people from getting into that business, that sort of thing. So it's very possible for rent control advocates to also be in favor of the land use change, but it's a little bit less common for the folks on the land use change side to be in favor of the rent control one. So already it's been pretty interesting to watch them actually in conversation with each other, which is unusual.
And we should just note for those who don't have the size of an acre kind of at their fingertips, about 40,000 square feet or so is an acre. So this would be roughly 8 lots per acre, which if you can imagine the lots that you'd see out in some of the further out suburbs in Boston, some of the wealthier suburbs, you've got several acres per lot in some cases where you could have many houses potentially being basically allowed to be built on those lots. So, all right. So then we have this hearing. The legislature takes all feedback on board, is very reflective, and comes up with a compromise solution, right, Jen? Is that kind of how it played out?
I'm going to just go and stare at a wall for a while on that one, this appropriately leading question. So, like I said, there is clearly a tension here. Housing policy is extremely complicated, and it means that to kind of go through the normal legislative and hearing process about it means, you bring in a bunch of people who are opposed, you bring in people who are in favor of it, you kind of hash through these different ideas. And on rent control, for instance, they've had plenty of proposals in front of them, from Boston's very kind of moderate proposal, which would be around 10% increases every year allowed, to something like Somerville, which again is more close to that kind of 5% range. But they haven't done anything with those. They also haven't done anything with this local option bill that has been in front of them that would just sort of let cities and towns decide what they want to do. So given that, to get to your core question, they did not approach this ballot measure as a sign that maybe they kind of should have gone through and really sort of kicked the tires on the rent control proposals and gotten into their committees and figured out sort of a compromise solution. Instead, several legislative leaders essentially said, we would like you diametrically opposed positions here on rent control, the ones who say this is an essential part of solving the housing crisis and this will destroy our rental market, to come together and give us a compromise proposal. So that sort of sentiment bubbled up over multiple days there, with lawmakers basically saying, well, why wouldn't you go through us on this? Why are you kind of shouting about this in public in a way that doesn't let people kind of fine tune the process here?
Yes, and I think a quote from Senator Friedman, Sidney Friedman, actually illustrated this very well.
So just building ourselves out of this is not going to be the solution. And this is why we all find ballot initiatives, and I know we heard from our last group, we're terrible, horrible, corrupt people, but this is why it is so hard to figure out how to solve these problems. It would be incredibly helpful if these two groups got together and said, you know what, let's find a way to do some of both. And I urge you to do that, because as much as I really I'm behind the intent of the rent control folks, I know there's issues. And yet I hear from you, and come on, guys, it's not going to destroy the economy. We have lots of data that says no. So we're left in the middle. So if you guys can just please start talking to each other and appreciate where you're both coming from, it would be enormously helpful for us, for you, and actually for the whole Commonwealth. So I beg you to do this. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Friedman.
The thing that strikes me about that is that that's kind of supposed to be the legislature's job in a way. Like when I read that, that's where my mind went. Am I being uncharitable with that reading, Jen?
I am not a very charitable person by nature, but I'll try and engage with that question charitably, which is, look, the reality here is that the legislature is trying to do a number of things on housing. That came up in the context of the lot size change ballot question, this idea of the Senate specifically is working toward kind of a big housing bill. But the issue, at least from kind of the rent control proponents side of it, is, lawmakers have had the opportunity to figure out what a compromise, what a reasonable solution might look like. Is it let every individual city or town set a certain measure, that's whatever they want? Is it let every city and town set a very specific measure if they want rent control? Is it basically have every city and town come to the legislature and say, hey, let us implement this in kind of a one-off case-by-case basis? And they haven't moved on any of those. So the idea of saying, we don't like being put in this situation because of the ballot measures where voters are going to have to just give an up or down on a pretty complicated, pretty strict, pretty uncompromising measure, like that frustration is real. It is much more dramatic than, in fact, anything that has been proposed by law before in the legislature. So they're not coming out of nowhere on the idea of, like, there must be something sort of in between the strictest measure and don't do anything. But because of the nature of ballot questions, there's something that feels sort of absurd to onlookers about watching people basically say, we have this position, and other people say, we have a complete opposite position. And then lawmakers who have kind of passed the buck on rent control then saying, we don't like that you're doing it this way. Why didn't you do it the way that we haven't done it?
Right. And here actually is Senator Brendan Creighton reacting to this idea of doing things via ballot question. He's talking about the lot size requirement ballot question.
With a ballot initiative like this, you lose that ability to compromise. And obviously a number of questions have been raised here. With such a strong willingness from the legislature, from this administration, and even previous administrations over the last few years, I guess, why are we going to the ballot on something that's so rigid where you have working partners here on this very issue, currently legislation in play? why not go with a more flexible approach in working with us here to get something passed that, may prevent some unintended consequences, may even improve the provision that you have before you?
Right. And there, of course, we're seeing a different kind of tension, which is that there is presumably more appetite inside the legislature for, well, can we adjust zoning rules? Remember, this is the same legislature that was fine with the kind of omnibus housing bond bill that ended up creating ADU allowances, or those accessory dwelling units anywhere that single family lots are allowed in the state. So in that case, Senator Creighton was kind of frustrated with the lot size change proponents for not working with the legislature on that one when there might be appetite for it. And I would note here that one of the really interesting things is the responses from proponents of the lot size measure when lawmakers seem to be kind of annoyed about going through this process rather than the legislative one, was actually to point at the rent control measure. And so that's that sort of tension that I was talking about at the start of this segment, which is, people are often geared up for this to be kind of a fight on a specific issue. People who are for rent control, people who are against rent control, people who are for the lot size change, and then groups like the Massachusetts Municipal Association who oppose that because it would limit local control over kind of the way that they're able to structure their communities. But to see kind of proponents of the lot size change say, we think the legislature should just adopt this language. They should just, take this off of the ballot question, just, adopt it now, enact it, then it doesn't have to go to the ballot. They were saying that would basically indicate to voters that the legislature is taking the housing crisis seriously, so they don't have to, if I would quote here, turn to price controls. So this idea that they're actually using one ballot measure as a way to kind of make the case for their own. If you don't act on ours, they might go for the other one, was also a very interesting tension.
The idea being that if you allow more production, if you allow smaller lot sizes, then you don't have to vote for rent control, and you don't have to take what, in the proponent's view of the lot size requirements, is a drastic measure of implementing rent control.
Right, that's exactly it. And one of the other tensions that came up was, if these things pass, let's say voters say we like this starter home proposal and we like this rent control proposal, if they pass them into law, the legislature would still end up having to get involved because, and this gets to my point about kind of the complexity of the policy here, the lot size change one includes things like access to sewer. What does that literally mean in practice? What is that going to look like on the regulatory front? Are there exceptions? Is it about sewer capacity, or is it just being able to be hooked into something? Those sorts of questions would still end up needing to be worked out on Beacon Hill anyway. So that was one of the other points that lawmakers were raising is, this seems like there are a lot of unanswered questions. And so we would perhaps like to work our way through these. And so again, you can sort of understand the frustration from the lawmakers' perspective, but then you can also look at it from the proponent's perspective and saying, realistically, if we're looking at the timeline of many of these bills over many years, if we don't kind of force the issue, you might never pick it up and then work out those details because, and this is the thing we have to point out every time, laws passed by ballot are just laws. They can be adjusted by lawmakers, they can be tweaked, they can be changed. If there is a ballot measure passed that would change the way legislative stipends work and they just don't like it, they could, if they weren't worried about the optics, all come in the next day and just undo that law. So the idea that this cuts off the legislative process is not entirely accurate, but it will impact how they are able to prioritize these different issues because suddenly they would have a law in front of them that they would need to decide whether or not to adjust.
And therefore, the clear preferred action would be we're going to take these up in a serious and sustained way, discuss, debate, and then pass something that makes sense. Right? Is that where this is all headed, Jen?
I don't like these questions you're asking me, Steve. They're
Didn't
hurting
you write
my
them?
head
This is
here.
your script.
It's true. So I think the kind of easiest way to put this here is they are clearly grappling with the implications of the ballot process this way. They
And
are.
yes, they are. And they have been in public too. And they've been very negative towards it. And like this hearing kind of illustrates why. And I apologize for jumping in on this, but I feel very exercised about it, Jen. And
No,
it's like,
and
if
that's
you don't
totally
like
understandable.
it, deal with the issue yourself. You know, you've had year after year after year of knowing that this is a problem. And eventually people are going to be like, okay, we're going to go to the ballot. We're going to vote for audits. We're going to vote for rent control or whatever. And if you don't, we're going to vote for marijuana legalization. And, you know, if you don't want it to happen in a certain way that a ballot committee wants it to, you got to deal with it first.
Or
I'm done.
or they could make it harder to do things through the ballot process. I think, you know, your point is well taken, because that has basically been the cry of proponents here. We have, aside from the repeal of the kind of sweeping gun control law that's going to be on the ballot regardless, because that's a repeal effort, we've got this 11 ballot question suite here, this potential 11 things that could go before voters. And a note I'd make that came up during the lot-sized one was that lawmakers are pretty aggressively starting to float the idea of like, well, would you be open to a grand bargain? Would you be open to, you know, having these discussions so we can take it off the ballot, off the plate of voters? And the interesting thing across different ballot measures has been, you know, that proponents are sort of wary about that. This idea of like, well, if I agree to that, then like you're going to have to move. You're going to have to propose something. There's going to have to be something that we see to agree to remove this from the ballot. But a lot of the discussion inside the hearing, not all of it by a long shot, but a lot of the discussion inside the hearing, particularly from Rep. Mike Day, was focused on just how expensive these ballot campaigns have gotten. The idea that, you know, they are paying large amounts of money to bring out, you know, signature gatherers along with their volunteers, and really kind of emphasizing the dynamic that you pointed to sort of up top, which is these have really become quite expensive campaigns. You know, we narrowly avoided, because of a completely unrelated settlement last cycle, what probably would have been the most expensive campaign in Massachusetts history, which was around the classification of rideshare drivers, like for Uber and Lyft, whether they were independent contractors or not, which was pretty widely criticized as an attempt to essentially buy a law here, by an exception to Massachusetts law. And this year, lawmakers have really kind of been taking that complaint very literally. They've been saying, you know, during all of these hearings, well, how much money have you spent? How many signature gatherers were volunteers versus paid? The idea that campaigning for a ballot measure, which is a process we have had for many, 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 many decades at this point, is kind of fundamentally becoming undemocratic in the way that they would classify democratic processes. So they're not really saying we would love to do more work, but they are saying, you know, this way of making us do work is not ideal to them for some sort of principled and some, I think, scheduling reasons.
Yeah, definitely. Way more to discuss on that, and we promise we will discuss it way more. There's more ballot questions and several more months before any of them will be decided, so we'll discuss it more, I promise.
That's right. I expect Steve and his big feelings will continue to exist. But for now, we'll be right back.
I'm Zainab Asma-Doyle, Research Director at the Massing Polling Group. The Massing Polling Group serves the region's leading foundations, political groups, government entities, and businesses. Our surveys and focus groups bring high-quality data to the toughest questions facing society today. Learn more at massingpolling.com.
Steve, can you believe we missed, I'm going to refer to my notes here, National Proposal Day?
I can't, Jen. Typically that's celebrated with customary cakes and dishes and dancing and that sort of thing. But somehow in the chaos of everyday life, I missed it this year. What is National Proposal Day, Jen?
No, you can't ask me this. It's one of those clearly completely fake holidays.
Yes.
It was allegedly allegedly on March 20th. And as two very separately, very married people, I, for one, am embarrassed that we didn't bring this to the single or, aspirationally not single listeners of this here podcast. But I was devastated to learn that there is a haunted Massachusetts angle to this. Steve, what is this? Steve, what is this?
Jen, and it's food related and Dunkin related, which means that we're contractually obligated to cover it. And it is the iDough ring box. iDough, D-O-U-G-H, for those of you confused at home. Ring box, which includes...
You think that'll address the confusion?
It'll address some of it. I'm about to address the rest of it. You might now be asking yourself, what is an iDough ring box? And the answer is that it is a pretty fancy looking Dunkin ring box where when you pop it open, it has a wedding cake munchkin and then you'll apparently put your engagement ring on top of that. And then that is how I suppose you would pop the question. If you really didn't like the person you were considering marrying, that would be one way to propose.
I have so many follow-up questions. I have more follow-up questions than could reasonably be healthy for the length of this segment. I would like to start with a very straightforward one, which is because it says this is a glazed blueberry cake donut hole with, quote, wedding cake flavored sprinkles. Steve, what do you think a wedding cake flavored sprinkle is?
I don't know, Jen, but if you had bought either a 25 or 50 count order of munchkins on March 20th, you would have been able to find out because you would have gotten a free iDough ring box and wedding cake munchkin while supplies last yourself.
Why are you doing this?
Now that we're here, unfortunately, Jen, I don't actually know. I have no idea what a wedding cake sprinkle is. It's haunted. You also apparently could have won some Vera Wang thing, who is serving as the, quote, Dunkin's chief proposal officer for the occasion, and some sort of getaway. But you're all too late now, so you'll just have to wonder until next year what wedding cake sprinkles taste like.
I really am hoping that we're not in some way liable under a horse race related contract for, bringing Dunkin news swiftly and in an actionable manner to our listeners, because honestly, I think we saved people a lot of confusion and rejected proposals here.
Well, you're welcome. And fortunately for all of you, that is all the time we have for today. I'm Steve Gazella, signing off with Jennifer Smith. Our production and theme music is done by Charlie Gazella. You can write to us at thehorseracepodcast@gmail.com if you proposed with an iDough ring box. Don't forget to give The Horse Race a review wherever you're hearing us now. Subscribe to Commonwealth Beacon's daily download and reach out to us here at the Massing Polling Group if you need polls or focus groups done. For now, thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.